All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first class of our five-session online seminar, Getting Started in Family History Research. My name is Kathleen McKenzie, Education and Programming Manager here at American Ancestors, and I will be moderating tonight's class. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. Our instructor for this first session is senior genealogist Melanie McComb. Melanie holds a BS from the State University of New York at Oswego. She is an international lecturer who teaches on a variety of topics, including colonial through 20th century American military research, genetic genealogy, Atlantic Canadian, African American, Jewish, and Irish genealogy. She is also an honorary fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society. She's had articles published in American Ancestors magazine and 50 Plus Advocate. She is also a blogger known as the Shamrock Genealogist. So, whether you are starting your family history research from scratch or you're working from inherited research, this first class will get you organized and work on recording your first pieces of genealogical information: names, relationships, dates, and places of birth, marriage, and death. Melanie will show you how to use standard forms such as family charts and family group sheets, and she'll also provide guidance on how to interview family, including yourself. We will have 3 breaks for questions during tonight's session, so at any time, please go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A field found at the bottom of your screen. You'll find a PDF of today's slides at the online course page, as well as a handout. And starting tomorrow, you'll be able to go back and watch a recording of tonight's presentation on that course page. All right, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Melanie.
Hello, everybody, and good evening, and welcome to Class 1 of our course. During this course, we're going to be covering the 5 steps that we've listed out here, and we're going to be starting with today's class being Identify What You Know, and then the next few classes will go into how you decide what you want to learn, which is doing that research planning and coming up with goals, identifying and locating your sources, or as I like to call, like doing, starting to put together your shopping list. Then I'll come back for class 4 in research after David does class 2 and 3, and then Rhonda will do analyze with step 5. So let's begin. The process for conducting family research, while it does seem straightforward, it's rarely linear, which means when you go through these steps, you don't simply go from step 1 to step 2 to 3, 4, and 5 and then end. You're logically going to go from one to the next, but at some point you may need to backtrack to revisit assumptions, perhaps maybe learn more about a location's records, or add research questions when new information appears. For example, at step 4, when you research, you may discover that you need to backtrack to step 3 to locate some additional sources and then go back and continue your research. The biggest genealogical principle we like to emphasize is that you want to work from the known to the unknown. And this is to make sure that you are researching the correct family. It can seem very appetizing to go and dig into an area that is unfamiliar to try to find records, especially when you're looking at international origins. But if you don't have enough information of the family from where they had settled, it can be hard and very confusing to perhaps pick up another family that you do not actually tie into. So we really want to make sure you're gathering as much of the records based on the people you've already established before you start digging more into those unknown areas, though. So thinking for a second as an example, think about maybe taking a really good look at your birth certificate. What information does it offer? Don't just look at just your name and date of birth, but what else does the record tell you? Does it give you the list of the names of your parents, their occupations, perhaps if you were born in a hospital, even the time of birth, and other information that you might find? You might even find that sometimes birth records can even have social security numbers on their birth records. So think of it as really trying to evaluate some of the earliest vital records that you have in your family. So step 1 is going to be identify what you know already. So, similar to like looking at your birth record, think about actually conducting an interview of yourself. A lot of times I've heard from people, they'll say, I know nothing about my family history. And I may challenge that and say, well, tell me about what your life was like growing up. Did you see aunts and uncles, cousins, grandparents? Were there any stories being told? And over time, you actually find that you were passed down some information. You may not have gotten all the way back to like fifth grade grandparents, etc., but maybe you have at least some information from your immediate family, cousins, grandparents, and maybe even great grandparents as well, and started to put together some of those stories. Perhaps there was some family lore that you were told, such as you were a descendant of a Mayflower passenger, or that you have family that goes back to Ireland or Italy or elsewhere. And so then you want to think about after you interviewing yourself is your next step is talking to relatives and thinking about all the information of what they already know and what stories they may have been told growing up. In the last part of our class today, we're actually going to do a deeper dive on actually how to conduct interviews. And then you want to start to think about recording the data as you're doing these interviews and gathering information into some of the types of templates we're going to go over during this class, which include things like family group sheets, five generation charts, and even software. A big tip we're always going to keep emphasizing to you is make sure you're always writing down what you already know. Since you know a lot already, it's very tempting to think that you will always remember a certain story or a certain fact about your family. So it's always good to make sure you're recording it in some format somewhere that you can easily go back to remember all those details. And that's going to be really important when you start going into conducting interviews, as we'll talk about later. So this is think of your toolkit of things that you may want to have at your disposal for doing genealogy research when you're starting to do this initial planning of what you already know and starting to write this information down. You want to start together some kind of notebook. It could be a marble notebook like you would use in school, spiral notebook, or it could even be a digital notebook like Evernote or OneNote program. So think about some kind of, notebook to start recording your notes down. And then you want to take advantage of some of the common templates that exist out there. So we have what's called a five generation chart, which we'll show you, otherwise known as a pedigree chart, family group sheets, and then we have research plans and research logs. And David's going to go into more detail on that in next week's class. And then you might potentially think about opting to go into genealogical software. However, that's completely optional. I know a lot of people that strictly stay completely offline with their genealogy research. But when you're recording this information, especially anything that's written out or printed out, always use pencil because you'll find that as you're working through your research, there are going to be updates you're going to be making or corrections to existing research that you have already have, whether you inherited it or maybe there was an assumption made that you needed to correct. So it's always good to think about that, genealogy is a lot like wet cement. And in this case, it's easier to put everything down in pencil so that you can easily erase away any of the errors so that you can correct it. On our website on AmericanAncestors.org, as well as on the course page, is a place where you can download these common research templates. And it's going to include things like the five generation charts, or otherwise known as pedigree charts, family group sheets, research logs, research plans, interview question samples, and more. So there's a wide variety of templates, and as we come up with different ones that we want to add to the website, that's a good place to check back to see if there's anything else that you might be able to use for your research. So let's start with one of the examples of the charts here. This is a five generation family chart and, and otherwise known as a pedigree chart. And we typically like to use five generation chart because pedigree chart doesn't sound like it's very relevant to genealogy. When I think of pedigrees, I think about like maybe horse pedigrees or dog pedigrees, and it doesn't seem like it really fits for people. So we kind of look at the idea of a five generation chart. So where you would start with is you would have yourself typically as the number one right in the center there, and you would fill in your birth information and if you were married, and where when you got so where when you were born, where when you got married, and then you start looking at number two is now your father's line. So you would fill in his information, birth, marriage, and if he was deceased, his death information. And your mother would go on three. So you would fill out the same information. Now, this chart was created by a man, so that's why the males are on the top level, on the odd, on term two, four, etc., and then the women are at the bottom. And the way that this numbering works is that when you're trying to calculate out someone, it's it makes it easier when you're writing up a report to kind of go back to it because you can just look at the different numbers and know that if you double the number, you basically get to the parents. So if you want to get to the parents of your father, that's number four. And if you want to get to the female of that line, you basically add one. So let's look at an example of one filled out. So in this case, and you don't necessarily have to put yourself as one. In this case, I actually put my grandfather. So my grandfather is Michael Joseph Doherty, and I listed his birth information in 1920 in Iona, Queens County, Prince Edward Island, Canada. I noted his marriage information, August 1941, Long Island City, Queens, New York. And I noted here his death in 1986 in Suffolk County, New York. And I listed his wife's name at the bottom there, Rose Alice Corcoran. And you'll notice I'm obviously using maiden names for the women. And then as I go throughout, I then go and identify, I go through Michael's father, Joseph Doherty, is number two. So I've listed his information that I know. And I've listed Michael's mother's information, Rose Veronica Rooney. So again, it's based on the person that is the subject in one. So you want to try to fill this out as much as you can because this is where you start to identify the surnames that are in your family tree, the different locations where they have lived, and what you already know about them. So I can quickly look at this and start to see where I have some gaps. For example, I see that Michael's great grandmother, who is Bridget, number 11 there, is we only have a first name. We don't have a last name, and we also don't have her husband's name listed. So that's completely blank. So there's very much a bit of a brick wall there with his grandmother's parents. And we also can see that there are other facts that are a little bit up to date where I don't see a lot of details, such as approximate dates with question marks, such as, let's say, Owen Doherty's marriage information. I had an approximate, I'm sorry, his death information. I have it approximately after 1901, PEI question mark. So again, something where I don't maybe have a clear defined fact. And as I keep moving through the other generations, you'll notice that in the last column there, I have no information on those ancestors. So that tells me that there could be a lot more that could be learned by going into this further. Another tool that you may use is what's known as a family group sheet. The family group sheet contains the pertinent facts about one particular family. We like to think of it as like a snapshot of the family because it's going to include the both parents and the children. So in this case, it's going to hopefully leave you enough room to put in all the key information. So their names, their birth dates, their marriage dates, their death dates, but also allow you to record information on their parents' names as well. So you see that there's some sections for father's father and mother's father and etc. listed on those fields. So that helps you to kind of marry that back to that 5 generation chart that we looked at. And when it comes to the children, it also should leave you some room to list their spouse's information as well. So this is another good tool that you can use to keep track of individuals' families when you want to look at all the children. because while it's tempting just to look at only the direct descendants, ancestors back, sometimes you have to go through the different children of a couple to try to learn more about that family. So here is an example of a family group sheet where I've listed out the information for my great grandparents, Joseph Doherty and Rose Veronica Rooney. So those are my grandfather's parents. And you see, I've listed out their birth, their marriage, their death information. And for Joseph and Rose, it also lists out their parents' information listed as well. And again, I can see all the children at a glance of where and when they were born. Do I have a date of death for them? Do I have a spouse's name for them, etc. And if you wanted to, you could even go into some of these extended relatives and create family group sheets for them if you were tracking all of their children. I also have a section I should note at the bottom here where it says sources of information. That's kind of like a quick place you can start to build a little list of some of the sources of where you got this information from. So I've noted that I've gotten information from census records or New York City marriage licenses, marriage index, Social Security death index, baptism records, etc. So starting to build a little bit of a citation log. Since genealogy can very much be wet cement, you really are thinking about that it is very much a working draft and you got to keep up with as you're doing your research of writing it down. So as you're finding new information, you want to make sure you keep some kind of working draft, even if it's like a Word document and you're something in your notebook where you basically keep a track of what you're doing over time. And then using the forms that are available can be really helpful. So we have these pedigree charts. You could do even online software solutions, whether through we have actually a tree product called Ancestries. You may want to use sites like Ancestry.com or Family Search to keep track of this information. Software like Family Tree Maker or Roots Magic or Legacy all have different ways of tracking information on whether it's through research logs or just keeping track of a tree. And then filling out these additional templates. So the family group sheets, interview forms or questionnaires. And of course, you want to, as you're coming across different documents, you want to save especially those originals so that you have them with you when you're trying to reference them for other research. So you may have noticed that as we were filling out the 5 generation chart and the family group sheet, that we use some interesting standards of how we record the dates and names. So we're going to take a moment and talk about those now. So when we're recording names, it's preferable that you try to write the surname in all capital letters. It sticks out and it helps to make sure that we're following a particular name and that you are identifying it, especially when you are dealing with last names that could be used as first names as well. It's good to be able to make very distinct that it is a surname. Always make sure that when you have women that you're recording them with their maiden name. We don't want to use them as Mrs. So and so. For example, my husband's name is Thomas, and I constantly get letters in the mail that say Mrs. Thomas McComb. While that may seem like proper etiquette, not in genealogy. You want to make sure that you are actually using their maiden name because that's how you're going to trace her family is through her maiden name. Now, if you don't know the maiden name, there are a couple ways you could indicate this in your templates or even on online software. You could use a question mark. You could use an abbreviation like MNU, which is like maiden name unknown. You could use just the given name. I have been told from like people that at Ancestry that you can even just type out something like 5 dashes in a row in software, for example, to kind of have it as a placeholder, or you just leave it blank and you just have a given name. And then you can always go back and fill that in. But this just makes sure that we don't want to assume that her name is her husband's name. Now, that could happen, especially if you have that they were distant cousins or it was just a coincidence that a Smith married a Smith. but when we know it, we want to make sure we're always, being sensitive to using her name. We also have a different convention when it comes to using dates. And this is just to make sure that we don't run into issues when we are dealing with both American and European records and with different audiences, that we want to make sure that we're always using this format where we want to use the day, month, so abbreviated to three, and year. We want it fully spelled out. So we don't want to use slash marks because in the example of 3/12/1823, for example, and if we had first we used 3/12/1823, that could be read as in an American convention as March 12th, 1823. If you were looking at a European or Canadian, for example, they might read that as December 3rd, 1823. If you use only a two-digit year, well, that could be many different centuries we're talking about. Are you talking about 2023, 2 years ago, 1923, 2023, 1823, 1723, 1223? It could be many different centuries. So we want to make sure we're being very clear on exactly what century you're doing with. So that's why you want to make sure we use this convention. And then when we're recording places, it's helpful to make sure that we list them out from the smallest to the largest division. So, for example, if we were looking at the township of Orleans in Orange County, Indiana, we would want to have it kind of spelled out that way: Orleans, Orange County, Indiana, so that we make sure that we're accounting for the township, the county, and the state. Now, if we were looking at something outside of the United States, we have almost a similar format, but you're basically going to use the townland or parish. So kind of similar to what we see for Orleans. We have the county, and now we're going to add in the country. Because if we're looking at mostly American records and American genealogy, we may not necessarily need to necessarily say United States, but if we're doing anything outside the United States, we want to make sure it's very clear when we're looking at a different country. Now, sometimes when you get into things like villages or other small municipalities, then it might be even multi-layered, even more so. So just think about the smallest level available of where someone could have lived, and that largely could be based on your records and then build that out. And the counties are really important because sometimes you'll even find that even within the same state, that there could be multiple counties that have similar town names, and that could get very confusing. It also helps because a lot of the records that you're going to find are going to be at the county level. So by quickly identifying the county of where that person lived in is going to help you identify records much more easily and be able to see at a glance where you have to account for that. And also when county borders change. You can't really see that if you're just looking at the name of the towns. And then of course, just be consistent with how you're recording the names. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about now inherited research. So, what happens when you have started to inherit research in your family? And this type of research could be something that could have been accounted for in, let's say, settling an estate of a family member or an estate sale, or perhaps you just had a relative that decided just to basically pass it down to someone to be the family historian. So we're largely going to be talking about, in this case, the focus on what we call genealogical papers. So really the documentation that is part of that genealogy journey. But it's also, when we talk about inherited research, it also includes family papers. So let's talk about the difference. So genealogy research papers, these can include these family charts, these family group sheets that we're talking about, maybe correspondence with different archives or other people that they've talked with in the family, their research notes, some of the records, maybe there's binders of other things. And so you're largely going to have a mix of original records and even photocopies. And then the family papers, think about are more of like those items that have been lovingly preserved and passed down through the years that document the lives of our ancestors. And they might consist of the family Bible, Maybe there was some really important estate papers or deeds or diaries, scrapbooks, or photographs. For example, I know that I've been getting some of the duplicates from my grandmother's wedding scrapbook, and I've been getting those over time. And I also know that my grandfather has a military scrapbook that eventually I will inherit. So for now, that's going to be more in the family papers bucket. And usually with the family papers, there's not a lot of organization for them because it's not really based on a research process. They're just items versus genealogical papers usually have some kind of organization. So you'll find the family papers are mostly the originals, and the genealogy papers might be more some originals, but a lot of photocopies. So I wouldn't be surprised though if you didn't have a mix of both, and perhaps the bulk of your papers is genealogical research, but you may have some of these other items in your family papers. But since we cannot talk about genealogical papers without talking about family papers, we're going to refer to both when we talk about the organization and classification. Okay. I don't have a lot of inherited research in my family, so I'm borrowing from a past coworker of mine, Ann Lothers, who you may have seen some work that she's done for American ancestors. And we're going to borrow one of her ancestors for talking about inherited research. So around the year 2000, so about 25 years ago, Anne had received several boxes of material from various family members that had belonged to her grandmother, Jennifer. And these family members knew that Anne was interested in taking responsibility for the materials and needed to get this stuff out of their house. And I'm sure you've heard that story many times. And she found that when she opened the boxes, the materials she inherited were eclectic to say the least. There were two boxes of with books, the history of Concord, Massachusetts, and the history of Mercer County, Pennsylvania. Westerworld to America about Palatine immigrants to Pennsylvania and other books. And then she had another box full of papers. And some of the papers are what we're going to be showing you here, and these were some of the invaluable information, but there was a little bit of information of not a lot of provenance on who exactly wrote the documents. So Anne had to go off some of the handwriting to figure out if they were written by her grandmother, Jennifer, or her mother-in-law, Maud Bell Plowman. So in this case, you might see like some of these handwritten notes here where you're trying to figure out, well, what do I do with this and how do I decipher the information? So Anna determined that these notes here are actually Maud's handwriting, so her grandmother's mother-in-law. And the document header says from Deborah H.G. Newton's book, April 1825. Okay, so it seems like we have some type of source. The issue is we don't know what is this book. Is it a Bible? Is it a prayer book? Is it a genealogy? We don't know what type of book this actually is because we don't have a full citation. The paper on the right-hand side was actually stapled to the first page of the Grosvenor genealogy. So, for our purposes, we're just going to call this Maud's copy of D.H.G. Newton's material, because she likely went through this genealogy of the Grosvenor genealogy and copied out the relevant pieces, which is not that uncommon that you would have seen in some early research. The box held a couple of sheets that looked as though they were a draft of a family history. Many families like to put together some type of manuscript if they're trying to look at typing it up for the family. And this had the hallmarks of Anne's grandfather's style, where it would be using a typewriter and then cutting material into lines to make revisions as they were going through that manuscript. I have a few manuscripts in my family where they were done by local priests that were in my family that were relatives, and in some cases they looked very similar to this. And Anne actually had in this in the boxes was Jennifer and Homer's fan chart. So in this case, she had actually penciled in a lot of the information about Anne's mother's family. And she had seen her grandmother working on this chart over the years. Now she had overlaid the colors to show the major family lines. Green is representing the husband's mother, blue is the husband's father, yellow is Jennifer's mother, and red is for Jennifer's father. Now, Jennifer didn't organize this the way we typically see these fan charts because typically we would see that the matrilineal line would usually be on the bottom right versus up at the top on the left, and the patrilineal line would be on the bottom left. So just keep in mind it's not fully accurate with how we normally see this. So the women's side is usually on the right, and the men's side is on the left. But Anne was actually able to confirm a lot of the information of what was entered in the chart, but there were a couple of curious errors, which we'll talk about. So, you've inherited all this stuff. One of the big questions you got to think about is what are you planning on doing with it? What is your ultimate goal? Because that's something you need to think about when you're working with inherited research. Are you looking at using this collection to advance and solve some of your genealogical brick walls? Focus your genealogical research. Maybe you're looking at a particular line and you need that guidance. Perhaps you wanted to do the ultimate thing and actually write the book, write some type of book about the family. Maybe you're looking to even donate this to some type of archive, whether it's a local historical society, a state library, or other places that may be of interest to that story. Or it's going to be passed down to the next generation, and you're just doing that cleanup and trying to put it in a format that would make sense for them. Maybe you know that you have to downsize, especially when you're dealing with estate settlements and having to deal with cleaning out different homes of, for example, deceased parents and others. You might find there could be a lot of information in there, and some of it, you know, you just don't have room for everything. So you need to downsize and prioritize what's really important. And then, of course, ensure the paper's survival so that you can help to conserve what's actually there, whether it's for future generations or keeping track of those family heirlooms. Your long range goal will help you most efficiently survey, organize, and integrate the information into your own research. Step number two is now, after we've kind of looked at the inherited research, which is the hardest, but now you have to identify, after you identify IVF first, now you have to actually organize the papers and photos. So you've gone through and actually seen what you have. Now you got to think about the organization process. Okay, so why do we think about why we need to organize your papers? Well, first and foremost, until you've looked at everything, it's really hard to know what to do with it. So you really have to look at everything to understand what this collection is made up of. And Anne had discovered when she was preparing this presentation that look at the collection is that if you revisit it 5, 10, 20 years later, you're going to have new insights when you go back to it as well. So it's helpful to really keep track of what you already have so you don't waste a lot of time going back through the same stuff you already did years prior. And if you're interested in integrating your relatives' work into your own, you need to identify what summaries or materials did they come up with that identified some of their research? Did they come through any particular conclusions or summaries on a particular family? And what does that include? And then also, what is the condition of the material? Do you have any fragile items that need special preservation? Are you finding that it is just riddled with staples, which you definitely want to take out because they are not conservation friendly? You need to think about possibly just what is the condition so you could take care of it. And while this webinar is really not about preserving your collection, though, we do have different um, resources on how you can do that. This includes also an online past webinar we did on organizing and preserving your family papers. And you can access this on American Ancestors. This can be accessed by going up to the by going up into the tools and then go into the video library. You also can go up under education and do past events, etc., to find this. And then you could scroll down to find the Organizing and Preserving Your Family Papers webinar. And I'll have Kathleen double check to see if we have it on the landing page as well, but I think we do. Okay, so there are two levels now of how you take stock of what you have in the collection. One level is to do the survey. So thinking about to do a more of a high level view and assessment of the collection. So again, think of it like so you're standing on a hill, you're looking out over the landscape, trying to assess the overall condition, situation, or value. And now you then have to create what's known as the inventory. So what is the itemized list of things that are actually are part of that collection? And this helps to make sure that it's supposed to be very detailed and a list of goods on hand. This is actually really helpful, I will say, especially if you're considering of donating your papers, because one of the first questions an archivist is going to ask you is, what do you have? And if you don't know what you have, it's hard for an archivist to answer the question of will they be willing to take it, and do they have the equipment and the staffing and the resources and the money to be able to do that. So doing this up front is going to be helpful in many different cases, whether it's to save your sanity, to know where everything is at home, or if you're just preparing a long-term place for these items. So when we do the survey, so what do you have? So these are some of the different types of materials you may have inherited. You may have personal family letters, scrapbooks, diaries, account books, Bible records, compiled genealogies that may or may not have even citations, photographs, hopefully some of them are identified at least, some genealogical information, school records, papers, and maybe even legal documents, wills, deeds, etc. Another facet of the survey process is identifying the names associated with your collection. After all, as a genealogist, we're seeking out names of ancestors and people. So you want to think about how you can identify who created the items that are in your collection that you've inherited, whether they created the letters, the scrapbooks, who's actually listed in those photographs that are there, and then you also want to take stock of the condition of the documents and photos. Do any of them need repair? Are they deteriorating? Do you need to put them in some acid-free folders, for example, etc. So the overall goals of the survey are to identify what types of materials you have in your collection, assess the overall condition of the materials, whether the type of materials and how fragile they are, and identify the major surnames that are captured by the collection so you know what's going to be important when you're researching those lines. Now, you want to write down the results of your survey. There's no point in doing all this work if you don't record the results. So on the left-hand side of the screen is a simple 5-category survey that groups your collection into different types of material, including genealogical material. So again, the family group sheets, the charts, research note, compiled genealogies, written material. These are diaries, books, letters, correspondence, documents, vital records like birth records, marriage records, death records, photos, and memorabilia. Memorabilia I like to think of like maybe if you have like an award or something that was given to someone, things like that, those kind of eclectic items. On the right-hand side of the screen is actually an example of a form that we actually use at the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center at American Ancestors. So what we actually have to do our own survey when we look at a new collection that's being received, and it gives us space to list the names of the families in the collection because we want to know who are the subjects in there, who were the major contributors to the collection, so we know who actually wrote the items and contributed the items, a summary of what's in the collection, and the columns to identify the document types and formats. For example, if you're looking at scrapbooks, are you looking at any digital media? Or maybe there's some obsolete media that's being used, conservation needs, and what archival materials may be needed to house the collection. So we may think about like what types of items we're going to need to obtain to help maintain this collection. So different types of folders and boxes, etc. So, for example, for an inventory now, when we try to look at itemizing what you have, you need to touch every item in your collection, evaluate it, and write down a description of the item. So, inventories are really good to be put into places like Excel spreadsheets you might find or an equivalent on Macs. So this is actually an example of what Anne put together, listing some of the items that she had. So it gives you the box number of where the item is kept, the item description of what it is, and just a brief description. So maybe it's like the Journal of Maud Bell Plowman with genealogical charts and notes. When was it created? And it's okay if you don't have an exact year, just give it a range so at least you have an idea of when it was, what years it was covering. Maybe they were noted in the records or even an approximate dates. who created it if you know that information. What is the condition? In this case, Maud Bell Plowman's journal has a broken binding and pages falling out. So that kind of tells you that it's probably going to need a little bit more work versus the envelope of photos is in excellent condition and doesn't really need a lot of work. So these are all going to be key information that you're going to use when you get to the evaluation phase, when you're starting to evaluate the items. So you want to think like a preservationist of like, I have all these items here. What do I need to do with them to make sure that they continue to be used? And now we're going to turn to our first round of questions. And then following this, we're going to look into classifying and organizing.
Great. Thank you so much, Melanie, for that great start to tonight's class and to the course in general. So for all of you out there, if you do have any questions, you can go ahead and type them in the Q&A panel found at the bottom of your screens. And just while we wait to see if any come in, Melanie, one thing I did want to ask is, you talked about recording information, writing it down, and things like family group sheets. I know a lot of folks kind of store all of that in something like ancestry.com. Does that work as well, or would you recommend using things like family group sheets and kind of separate files like that?
Yeah, that's a great question because I will touch upon a point that we'll get to later. But in general, I like to say you like to have your documentation in different formats just in case. Because if you have it all digital, and let's say your computer, doesn't work, you can't access those files. If the site ceases to exist and you didn't download them from someone like Ancestry, or it's inaccessible, it's always good to have a backup of that somewhere else too. So it's always good when you can is to make a hard copy for some of that information, or at least put it in another format. So if you have one item in the cloud, have it one item locally. So this way you can access them at different places. And this helps so that, for example, if the internet's not accessible somewhere, you could go to your research and be able to continue on.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And we do have some questions coming in here. So first up, somebody is wondering, how do you list multiple marriages?
So with multiple marriages, sometimes you might find that it can be a little tricky with the some of the charts. So typically, what I would do for something like that is you may want to split out into different family group sheets. So if you know that there are, especially if there are children from multiple marriages, that might be a good way to kind of split out the parents on there. And then for your 5 generation chart, it really depends on your focus. So if you were doing just your direct ancestors, I would just do it from the parents of that child that is the direct ancestor for you. But you also could, if you wanted to look at that other marriage later on, maybe have a separate chart for them.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then someone is wondering, do you have any recommendations about digitizing original documents and photos?
So there could be a lot of ways on how you digitize them. I mean, one thing I would recommend is if you have a good scanner or even like an app on your phone to get a really good image quality. You want to get a high res image of it. Sometimes I can recommend putting them in TIFF files because that can be a nice preservation for that. I think we do have some information on some of our in our video library of other places for preservation. Maybe Kathleen, you have something you can put in the
Yes. Yeah, I
chat or
can include that. I can include it in my follow-up email, and I'll also add it to the course page as well. So yeah, we can definitely do that.
right, because we definitely have a lot of things that we do on. We have a Preserving Your Family Treasures research guide. I think that one might be appropriate because that really talks about how you preserve these items, and in some ways, some part of the preservation process could be digitally handling it as well. So I would take a look at that and see what's there. I think there are some different vendors and different guides that are used on how to digitize as well.
Okay, perfect. All right, and then we have a question here from someone who says, I've received photocopies of what looks to be some kind of newspaper or publication like a book, but I have no reference to the source. How would you record that?
Sure. So I would typically try to record it based on what you think the item is. So if it looks like a newspaper, and especially if you have like the yellowing paper on it, and you can kind of tell the quality of like a newspaper, what it feels like, you may want to record it as such. And something what I would try to do though is to really make a really good inventory is try to see if you could seek out the original. Sometimes I find I can take an abstract of some of the information from a document and maybe just take like a unique phrase or sentence from it and maybe try doing like a Google search or a newspaper search to see if you can come across where that might have come from. Because that might help you come across if it was like a published genealogy, a county history, or like a newspaper article, like you said, that could come up. So that could be another thing I would look at too, because then you have a better idea of what that source is, and that's going to be important when you evaluate it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And then we have a question here from someone who says, "My ancestors had multiple spellings of their last name. How should I record their information?"
That's a great question. In some cases, what I would see some clients do is that they would actually create a portion of like maybe their group sheets or a Word doc, and they would list all the variants of their names spelled out. Because you will find, as you know, that when you're researching that you may have names coming out in different ways because spelling wasn't consistent until really late 19th century. So, by having a list of all the variants of the names out there, it gives you ideas of how to search for your ancestors' family by using that for different websites and other places for, being able to refer back to. So that would be my little tip.
Okay, great. And then we just have one more question here, and I think you might get into this a bit more in the next kind of section, Melanie. But
hmm
this question is, do you have a special type of box or portfolio system to use for what we have?
So there are different ones that you can use. I mean, the most popular ones I will say that from an archival standpoint, and we have it listed on that Preserving Your Family Treasures guide. Usually like Hollinger boxes, they have like metal edges on the end. They are very good for um, keeping items in there. And usually any other items you could also use through Gaylord Archival. That's another really good vendor where you can get that. The biggest thing is you want to make sure you're not having anything that's going to introduce acid or anything that's going to like or light or anything else that's going to really interfere with the preservation of that item. So those are some of the vendors I would really look to look at their particular items, and they usually have something for any type of product. I remember years ago when I did receive the family Bible. Ironically, there were no pages filled out in it, but I have the Bible. Um, I actually obtained a Bible box, and I think I got that from Gaylord Archival. And I got a nice box that is shaped just perfectly for a family Bible. So sometimes you'll even find specific products that they could recommend for different things because you can get something very small or something very large.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Melanie. Excuse me. So it's looking like that will wrap up questions for now. At any point while Melanie is talking, you can go ahead and pop your questions into the Q&A panel. We'll have two more question sessions tonight. But for now, Melanie, I'll go ahead and pass things back over to you.
Great. Okay, so now our step three on inherited research is classifying and organizing. So kind of getting a little bit to what we're talking about during the Q&A. So we need to think about taking note of the current organization system that's already in place for that collection. And you may find that some materials are already in notebooks or binders, or you might be dealing with unsorted papers. So you want to take note of exactly what is already in their current format because that might be a reason of why that's being kept together. So you want to make sure before you take everything out of the binders that you keep those items together to make sure that you are saving that provenance of why it may have been saved that way. So, and should you save? Well, you can't really save everything. So you want to save those items that are really going to be unique and significant. Obviously, the priority should be on anything that is original. diaries, letters, things like that. Anything that could tell a story that's handwritten, that has the handwriting of your ancestors, signatures, other mementos, things that you can't replace. If it's something like a printout from like a site like Ancestry or Family Search, I wouldn't worry about just like, the printout page of the record. You could easily get those, another time. So really preserve what's original first. And then even when you're looking at the research papers, if you're finding that it's the same family over and over again, you don't need 20 copies of the same group sheet. Maybe two would be enough just to have it. But you want to make sure you're really downsizing what you actually need and what's the most recent version that's been done. You don't necessarily need all the drafts. So think about prioritizing the most recent versions of that paperwork and then also make sure you're labeling anything that you have that. Because otherwise, you don't want to end up with the picture that's photographed here where did I put that family chart? And that could be very hard to go back to. You then want to refine your classification scheme. So a good arrangement groups like things together so you don't have to look in several places for closely related items. And records can be arranged in many different ways, including by chronologically, so by the years, alphabetically, or by document type. So you have to think about what system is going to make the most sense to you. There really is no one way and correct way to arrange a collection. So, a top level organization that a lot of people like to use is the surname or maybe a specific family line. Many genealogists will even just have a separate line built out for each of their grandparents as a way to be that's the top level. And then by the second level, you can then break down into individual people, by a couple or a family, or by maybe like document types. So here are all the papers related to births, here are all the marriage records, here are all the census records. Then at a third or fourth level organization, you could then consider grouping by the type of material or record types. So again, kind of grouping together here are your genealogical material, your notes and charts, documents, written material, photos, memorabilia, and then maybe even want to record by location because that also could be helpful if maybe you know that your ancestor went from, let's say, New England out to Ohio. You might want to reflect, the records that were maybe back in New England separately from the Ohio ones. And then again, you could then start to look at refining it by the record type: vital records, church records, cemetery records, census, military, deeds, probates. It really depends on what you want to use it for. But a big thing you want to do is use the KISS method. Keep it simple, but be consistent. You don't want to make this overwhelming for yourself. It's already a lot to go through inherited research. It's another thing to maintain it as well. So think about something that you are going to use in the future that is going to be easy to do and start small. I know that I have a lot of papers, for example, at home, and it looks like I'm just hoarding them and it's taking forever. So I'm slowly starting to go through those papers and I'm slowly starting to put them into some file folders and put them into a file cabinet so that I can get into a nice organized way and out of the way that I can easily go in and find it. So think about what method's going to work for you when you come up with this. And you could start small with even just like a shoebox full of photographs or just a small pile of papers when you start. So once you're ready to begin organizing the papers you received, you can then take everything and start by sorting them into different surname groups. This is going to take some time, but it's going to have a lot of benefits because if you can group the things by by the surnames that you're interested in, it's going to make it easier when you have to actually go back and find that item. So if you're looking for that journal associated with the Plowmans, you're going to want to associate it with the Plowmans, for example. So you want to make sure that you keep that together. So in this case, you might find that your genealogical materials, could be including written material, it could be photos. All these items could hold into one family surname. So in that case, it's good to think about when you're taking your survey of your information, you then organize it by the surnames that you're ready to take hold of. Here's another way to think about an organization scheme. Think about it as nested layers. So at your top level is your surname group. And then within the surname group, you have multiple individuals that share that surname. Within each individual's files, you may then have material organized by a type of material or a type of record. And then finally, the smaller item is the physical item that you filed. Then you want to place your item into some kind of container, folders, or boxes. And as I mentioned, it could be something as simple as like file folders in a filing cabinet or an expanded portfolio. It could be binders, it could be Hollinger boxes, it could be all types of different materials. And then since the question came up about digitization, is you want to think about what you want to digitize, the material you have. So the advantages obviously are if you digitize them, it's readily available at your fingertips. You can have them on your computer or a flash drive or an external hard drive and take them with you even when you travel. You by applying file naming conventions to your files, it can make it easier to try to locate what you're looking for. So, for example, I like to make sure when I'm putting files on my computer that I'm identifying the subject, who, then when, so what year or a range of years, what is the type of record. So in this case, like if we had Homer Jacob, 1810, a deed, and where. So that's kind of giving you those main points of what we're putting in there. So who, when, what, where. And digitization is obviously going to save you space than if you have all these items at home. There obviously are some disadvantages to some digitization as well, I should talk about though. Storage technology is always changing. There are always going to be different programs and companies that exist out there. Some of them are going to go out of business, that they're going to change formats. It can be very time consuming if you're trying to scan lots and lots of paper. And if you're not comfortable with digital, it can take you time to really go through the digitization process. So again, you need to think about what is important to digitize, if at all, and making it very simple. All right, step 4 now. So now you want to think about evaluating that research. It's very possible the inherited research you have could be 10, 50, even 100 or more years old. So you're going to be looking at it from a different pair of eyes than the person that put this together. So you're going to want to look at using good genealogical practices that have evolved now to apply that to that collection. This is a snapshot of some of the key changes in genealogical research practice. Did you know that Lemuel Shattuck, who was one of the founders of the New England Historical Genealogical Society, he actually developed early versions of the two most used forms in genealogical research, and that is the family group sheet and that 5-generation chart. He also contributed to the design of the 1850 census form and was a co-founder of the American Statistical Association. So he was a brilliant mind. And it was in 1841 when he developed the forms. In 1880, there was then a huge surge in the publication of compiled genealogies that were both as standalone family histories and also county and town histories. That was when a lot of the different counties were being asked as part of President Grant's proclamation is to create these county histories to celebrate, their history. And the method for writing a genealogy at the time would spend a lot of years where you would engage in correspondence with relatives who could be very far away. So a lot of, mail correspondence, or maybe going to meet them in person if possible, and learning different facts about their family. But unfortunately, we find that for a lot of these genealogies, the letters that actually were part of this process have not survived. And we don't know exactly who contributed what information so we can evaluate anything about the person providing that information. We're really going off of what the final product was, which is that genealogy, which was appeared to be unsighted. In 1964, almost 60 years, over 60 years ago, the Board for Certification of Genealogists was actually formed to credential professional genealogists so that they have some kind of almost like a way of almost like a licensing, them saying that, hey, these persons have the credentials if you hire them for research. Because at that time, genealogists were the ones that would seek out original material from courthouses, cemeteries, churches, and of course other relatives, and sometimes you needed to hire someone to do that research. Now, approximately when we get into the 1990s is when we start seeing the internet taking off, when we start to see being able to search and use search engines and even using, sites like AOL and Prodigy and Netscape and others to do some of that internet research. And over time, the internet's actually replaced a lot of boots on the ground. A lot of us will turn to doing genealogy research online first because in some cases, a lot of the records are already available there for us. And it wasn't until 2000 that the GPS or the genealogical proof standard was born, which actually guides us on how we conduct our genealogy research today. So, what is the genealogical proof standard? So, I call it the GPS for short, and think of it like a GPS, like you have a GPS for your car, GPS for genealogy. So, there are five different proof standards involving reasonably exhaustive research, complete and accurate source citations, thorough analysis and correlation, resolution of conflicting evidence, and soundly written conclusion based on the strongest evidence. Now, if we look at the points here that are most important, uh, number two, three, and four are the most important for inherited research because those are the ones we're going to use the most often there. So we might rephrase these different points as taking it as, does your collection include original documents? To kind of look at that exhaustive research. Do they include citations? How does the inherited research compare to your research? So trying to look at that thorough analysis correlation. And can you explain any contradictions? So resolving that conflicting evidence. So when you're using the GPS as a guide, you want to think about following these steps. So step one, you're in checking the inherited collection for any original documents. So doing the reasonably exhaustive search of trying to identify all the original documents that are in that collection. Then your step two should be to check all the genealogy forms that may have been kept for any citations that have been noted. So any of those notes, etc., that you find, you want to note if they have any citations so you know where that information might have come from. Then you want to then compare the new material to what you already know and try to identify where the gaps are. Did you find something new in that inherited research that you didn't come across? Are there any areas of disagreement? And can you look to resolve those? And then think about correlating steps elements 3 and 4. That's when you guys then start to think about, well, I need to make a to-do list because maybe you find there is more research to be done based on what you've already evaluated. And once you've started to do that, then you're going to start to then do the research and add new information to your tree. And as we mentioned, you want to make sure you're keeping a running list of what you need to do as you evaluate, because you're going to keep coming up with different types of records or questions that you have as you evaluate your research that you've inherited. So, how do we evaluate this new information? Well, the first thing is, do we have a citation of where the source of the information is? We need to evaluate the source. Is that source credible? Is that source firsthand, for example? Is it secondhand? Does the collection contain a record that has new information even if there is no citation? So even if there is no citation, new information is something we want to pay very close attention to and then evaluate the record itself. So even though we can't evaluate the source, we can at least try to evaluate the information that's contained in the record. And then we want to apply what's called the sniff test. Does this information seem reasonable given what you know about the time, place, and family? Is the information totally out of left field, or is it in the same time, place, and family that you've been studying? And then what you want to do is you want to find a source for that information to corroborate that. So here's a process flow that might help you if you're more visually inclined. As you review your relative's information, you want to ask yourself your questions. So let's say you found a fact from one of your pedigree charts, 5 generation charts. First question, is this fact new? If yes, you want to continue on. If no, move on to another fact because you already know that information. So maybe it's not really relevant right now. Then you want to see, is there a citation for the fact? If yes, You want to evaluate it. If no, is there a document supporting that fact? If yes, you go to evaluate. If no, do the sniff test. Does it make sense for the time, place, and what I know? If yes, evaluate. If no, flag it as a potentially unreliable fact. Let's talk about the principles behind evaluating the research. Analysis focuses on the source and the information. To analyze a source, you need to make a determination whether the source is original, derivative, or authored. For the information, you need to make a determination whether it is known firsthand, secondhand, or unknown. Let's return back to Anne's grandmother's mother-in-law's notes. And this is what we called Maud's copy of Deborah H.G. Newton's book. As we recalled earlier at the top, it has a notation that it is from Deborah H.G. Newton's book, but we really don't know what this means. So let's evaluate the item. Are the facts cited? No. The notation is very unclear. We don't know what Deborah Hall Grosvenor Newton's book is. That's dated 1825, if it was a Bible, a journal, or a genealogy. Next question. Is there a document or book in the collection that contains the information? No. Does the information make sense for the time, place, and family? Yes. So it seems there is some type of possible new information that we want to look into. Let's take a closer look at sources. When we're talking about original source, we're talking about something that was actually being created at the time of that event. So from the time period being researched, and these could include a duplicate original that was made, a record clerk's copy, or even an image copy in that case. Something to think about though is even if you're finding something that's been digitized on microfilm or microfiche, it is considered original for analysis purposes because it is a record that was created at that time of the event. So the image on the right is a digital image of the original probate from Frederick County, Maryland. The digitization is just a way of making it accessible to see it so we don't have to go all the way to Frederick County, Maryland to look at the probate ledgers. So Maud's copy is not an original, but this copy is. Derivative sources. This is when it is written by somebody else who was not present at the time of the event. So these are going to include transcripts, extracts, or abstracts. Oftentimes, these could be done by different people that are studying those records, whether they're doing like one place studies or they're studying a particular area and they're researching, let's say, all the probates of a county, for example. They are very far removed from it, and that's why it is derived, because they are deriving information from the original and they're not even necessarily making a full transcription. And even with transcriptions, there could be errors because they are copying that information. And also something to keep in mind is that the writer's memory could affect the contents. So sometimes you could find that there could be a bias that could potentially be introduced by accident into those records. Let's just go back for a second. And that image, by the way, is from our website, American Ancestors. It is our New York State wills, and it is showing these different abstracts of information from the surrogate court records. So you'll see it's very abbreviated. Another type of source is what's known as an authored source, and these are a special class. The quality of these sources generally depends on how faithfully the authors have documented their facts. These obviously are held in a lot more esteem because they do include more proper citations. Robert Charles Anderson, for example, the head of the Great Migration Study Project, has been researching these families for many, many years, trying to find every record possible on immigrants to New England between 1620 and 1640. And also we have the Mayflower Silver Books, otherwise known as the Mayflower Families for Five Generations, which is looking at the descendants of Mayflower passengers. And again, trying to find as much information as possible. Now, two boxes of Anne's grandmother's collection was published books, but it took a while to figure out which books and how reliable the information was. So we've covered evaluating a source. Now let's move on to covering the information. When we evaluate the information, again, we want to know, is it firsthand from someone that was a participant at that event? Was it reported soon after the event? In this case, both of these have green flags, so they are very good when we're evaluating. Now, if it's reported long after the event, it's a yellow flag. It could still very much be valid, but if it's so long after the event, there could be a memory issue. If it's secondhand from a non-participant and reported soon after the event, it is a yellow flag. It still could be valuable information, but it's not from someone that's actively participated in it. So there could be some errors. If it is reported long after the event by a secondhand participant, we definitely want to put it as a red flag. And especially if there's someone we cannot tell who provided the information, we also want to flag it as a red flag because we need to put that as possibly an unreliable narrator. Who provided the information in a record? The most reliable information is provided by someone that is a participant. If someone else provided the information, it is sort of like the children's game of telephone. So when you see a couple getting married, both of them are the participants, as well as even the officiant that performs that ceremony. But if we look at a game of telephone of someone reporting that marriage, we may find that person number one may report Aunt Kate got married in December but was born in May. And by the time they get to person six, somehow that story got around to Aunt Kate got married and her son was born in May. So way different from what we remember it. So if we evaluate the informant in this record, this was actually the marriage record of Anne's great-grandparents, James Lathers and Elizabeth Wallace. Sometimes when you identify the informant, it requires you to understand how a specific type of record was created. Town and county clerks generally recorded the marriages they performed in a register or book. If the marriage was performed by someone else, such as a minister or justice of the peace, they had to complete what was called a report or return, where they gave that information back to the town or county clerk. So for this record, we see that the informant was a participant in the event. It was the minister who officiated at the wedding. Going back to Maud's list of information about the Grosvenor family, we don't know who the informant was, but in the record we do. We also need to consider how long after an event the information was written down, because again, memory could be an issue. Let's take the example of someone that's arrived in the United States that was an immigrant. Here, the example is an arrival at a port in the United States. One record may be the passenger list that's filed at the arrival port on the day of arrival. But what if instead we were looking all the way back at the 1900 census at the date of immigration provided to the enumerator? If the arrival in the United States is 50 years ago and the head of household is now 85, how accurate do we think that the date is? Do they really remember the exact year, or is it really just more of an estimate? Back to Anne's great grandparents' marriage. You'll also note there are two dates listed here: the date and place of the marriage, and the date the marriage was returned by the ministers to the city of Cambridge. So we see it's about 45 days after the marriage that the clerk of the city of Cambridge wrote down the marriage. And that's not too bad. But we need to keep that in mind that sometimes when ministers would have their marriage returns, if they were not timely with their notes, sometimes there could be errors introduced, especially since they're not returning it right away. So we might start to come up with a tentative to-do list. We want to find confirmation of the information on Maud's list of data about the Grosvenor family, such as finding maybe an author genealogy that has the citations, and also look at some town records from Pomfret, Connecticut, where they were from. Big tip though, especially when you're going through this research, is you want to start slowly, one line at a time. It's very easy to skip back and forth and want to go into other side lines, but if you really want to work on one particular line, you want to very much keep concentrate all the records you can about one generation before you keep advancing forward. Let's evaluate another example. So this was the manuscript that we had listed earlier that was mostly ignored 20 years ago, but Anne had actually read through this carefully and found some clues in here. She had noticed that the Carrington and Taylor families were mentioned. She had actually been spending a lot of time going through online sources for these families, trying to take them back to from London, Ontario back to England. The problem is that the surnames Taylor and Carrington are way too common to make headway. But buried in the manuscript, there was a note about that the Taylor and Carrington's families were church wardens in Chapel and Frith in England. So now having a place makes it a lot easier to continue that research because there might have been a clue that already was obtained from the family. This is what Anne's grandmother recorded on her fan chart. George Taylor, born about 1819, died 1886, to parents Joseph Taylor and Mary Carrington. Well, let's evaluate the items that we have here. Are the facts cited? No, we don't have a citation for that information. Do we have a document or book in the collection that contains the information? No. Does the information make sense for the time, place, and family? Yes. So we do have some information that still should be evaluated with the English location, but we need to add this to our to-do list. So we add on to our to-do list that we want to examine the church records of Chapel and Le Frith for George Taylor's birth and the marriage of Joseph Taylor and Mary Carrington. Given especially that the family might have been involved as being church wardens, they very much would have been part of those church records. You also may want to make a color-coded to-do list, for example, which makes it a lot easier to see visually which branches of the family need work. For this chart, Anna actually put information from the fan chart into a software program and then printed the result as a 5 generation chart. She then marked in yellow the people that were new to her and that needed to be verified. There is no standard here for color coding the task. It is completely up to you. But maybe coming up with some kind of legend can help you identify where you need to come up with information. So she had actually listed, besides the ones in yellow, the red are she needs to find a fact, blue is find the documentation for the fact, and green is noting that it's from the Plowman Register, and yellow is the verification of someone you want to look into. So you may have your own system for this. Step 5 is doing the planning phase. This is going to be discussed by David in our next class. So for now, let's turn to our next round of questions before we get into interviewing relatives.
Great. Thank you so much, Melanie. So we have a couple of questions coming in here. So first up, there was a question, how would you record an adopted child within the family?
Okay, so it really depends on what your goals are, I will say. So a lot of times I will see that someone may record the adopted child because they are pursuing the biological lineage of that adopted child. And in that case, then you would want to list the biological parents as the parents, but maybe perhaps in the group sheet, the family group sheet, you might want to note who are the adoptive parents as well. So that could be one way to do it. If you are just recording the adopted child as a relation, but you're not pursuing the biological line, then you may just want to make a notation that the parents were non-biological, but that they were the custodial parents in your notes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And then just double checking, you had talked about original, derivative, authored sources. What are microfilmed copies within that?
So a microfilm copy is just a format of that copy. So if you're looking at something that was produced that has that original handwriting of the item, then it can be an original. So you need to evaluate the handwriting maybe of like a town record, for example. Does it look like it's consistent with that writing of that time? Or does it look like something that may have been compiled later with a more um, contemporary pen, for example? So that gets into a little bit of paleography, but for general purposes, try to think of a lot of microfilm copies of records usually are originals.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then a question here, would you ever use inherited information to verify and validate what you already know through your own research?
Absolutely. And that's something you should definitely should do is try to take stock of what you have because a lot of our family members when they did that original research pre-internet, they had their own, they did all that correspondence and things that we don't really do a lot today, and you never know if they've come across something that you haven't been able to. So absolutely, you definitely should supplement with what you've already done and try to fill in some gaps.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And then another question, I think probably inspired by the adoption question of kind of how you record that. How would you recommend recording something else like an artificially inseminated child to a family marriage?
Yeah, so again, I think it depends on the goals. Are you trying to create a genetic tree, which you do more with like DNA, trying to look at that biological father, or if you're trying to just look at the parents? So I think you have to think about what kind of tree you're making and then decide from there.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Melanie. So it looks like that will wrap up questions for now. I know we still have a good amount to get through, so I'll pass things back over to you, and then we'll have our final question session at the end of the lecture tonight. But
Okay.
passing it back over to you.
All right, thank you. And apologies are going a little over here.
Oh, no
Okay.
problem.
All right, so we're going to talk about some tips for interviewing relatives. Okay. Interviewing your relatives is a really worthy endeavor because this could be the time and place where you could start to really identify some of the different family stories and try to learn more about your immediate relatives, which could give you some clues into your family history. So, we want to think about how you can plan your project. Who do you want to interview? You obviously want to prioritize the oldest relatives first because you may not be able to have access to their stories at a later time. Then you want to think about, are you interviewing, for example, parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, older cousins, for example, and even siblings. Sometimes you might even have information too. And then think about, what do you want to know? So coming up with those goals. Think about some questions that you want to ask them and what research you might need to do in advance. Sometimes if you know that there's a particular um, person that grew up in a particular part of New York City, it might be helpful to maybe get yourself familiar with that part of New York City when you ask them questions so you can stay focused with what they're talking about. You'll think about how you interview them. So, what is the format? And we'll talk about that, including, whether you're doing it in person or remotely. How you make the narrator comfortable. You want to make sure that everyone is comfortable and consents to this process, and that you're not introducing anything into that interview process. And then think about the long-term goals of what are you doing with the interview and how you preserve it. So we're going to go through each of these steps. Okay. So while you may not be doing a formal oral history project, these are some principles of practice from the Oral History Association that you may want to take into account when you're doing these interviews. Is you want to respect your narrator by honoring their communities, their perspectives, and their stories. You want to be transparent about what the final product is about when you're doing these interviews and how they can get access to it, and make sure that you have consent at all steps of the process. There also could be power differentials between the interviewer and the narrators, so you want to make sure you're very sensitive with how you develop those questions and schedule a time to meet with your relative, especially when you're dealing with older relatives where you might be the younger of that family. You want to make sure you're doing it in a respectful way that is sensitive to their time and needs. You also want to protect your narrators by making sure that they have an opportunity to review that interview that was done. If there's anything they want to restrict that they maybe had said and they want to kind of redact it and don't let it, go out into the public, or any content they're not familiar with. Keeping in mind it's really their words they own and you do not. Think about how you can preserve that process in the product because there could be ways of how you can contribute oral history to local historical societies and other places to maintain that in the stories. And then, of course, just finally, just being ethical about how you're using this information and being very upfront about what your intentions with these interviews for, if it's going to be just for your family history research, or do you plan on publishing as well? All right, so step one you need to figure out is, well, who do you want to interview? So when we think about interviewing our relatives, we often think about interviewing the relatives who are older than we are, which is absolutely something that you should do. But making sure we don't discount the younger relatives as well. For example, you might have adult nieces or nephews that may have different stories to tell growing up in your sibling's house that maybe you just were not privy to. So when you have different family members that grew up in a different household, there's a very different dynamic and what they might recall. So they might have their own stories that maybe your siblings didn't share, but that they were passed down to settle that as well. And there is a certain order to this list I'm showing you, and that's in priority of who you should talk to first. So again, those older relatives, because they're not always going to be available, and especially if they have serious health issues or memory loss or dealing with things like dementia and Alzheimer's. You want to really prioritize those and then move down into your contemporary and younger relatives. Next is you're asking your relatives to participate. So sometimes if you know them really well, it can be simply as just asking them and tell them why it's important to you and that you want to make sure you want to tell their story and that it's important to you. And you might just want to note about what is the scope of your project and intent. Now, if you have relatives that are not as well known, you may have to make more of a formal introduction. And that could be going through a mutual relative for an introduction, maybe an email or a phone call can helpful to work out, making sure they're very well aware of how are you related to them so you don't come out like a stranger. And sometimes even asking that mutual relative if you can, if they can be name dropped in a conversation with them so they know like, oh, like I talked with Aunt Patty and they know Aunt Patty well. And then think about the time commitment that's going to be involved with what you're looking for and what are you going to do with the interviews and start to move that in motion. Step 2, determine what you want to know from the interviews. So this is going to include defining your scope of interview and doing some research on the subject of your interview. You then want to consider your questions, knowing that they could go in a couple of different directions. For most straightforward interviews, creating a set of well-defined questions in advance is perfectly fine. However, sometimes it's more helpful when you're doing an oral history approach that you want to have more of a question outline because it gives you flexibility to ask questions as things come up in the conversation, and it might feel a little bit more natural than kind of jumping off to the next topic right away. So you want to think about what's going to make the most sense. You also may want to identify any photos or documents or other things that might help prompt your narrator. And sometimes so it can be helpful to have those props. You then want to define the scope of the interview as a statement of purpose. So, why are you doing this interview? And why have you chosen this person? So, are you trying to cover a specific time period? Are you looking at an overall biography of their life? For example, are you looking at different maybe historical events they lived through, like for example, like Watergate or the 1960s? Are you interviewing people that are first generation immigrants or war veterans? So there could be reasons why you're interviewing them. So you want to think about, is it overall their whole life story or something very specific? And if you're doing straight shot interviews with relatives about their lives, which are biographical scope, there's plenty you can ask about, but some general ideas are thinking about asking about their childhood, their young adulthood, if they got married or had partnerships, if they had any children, or their career, or hobbies. That could be something that very much can prompt a lot of talking points. You then want to start to maybe do some initial research on how you actually can help facilitate these interviews. So, for example, if you were going to interview your uncle who served in the Korean War, but you don't know anything about the war, your questions may be kind of vague and may not be the right questions to ask. So, especially if you're doing like military research, it's helpful to read up on that military conflict so you can get some of those key dates, for example, when the US entered the war, what battles were fought, maybe what unit they might have possibly been in, what troops were involved. And then you can then start to create maybe a biographical form for relatives to fill out beforehand, before you formulate your questions. So this gives you an opportunity to at least have some simple dates and names, maybe some locations. They can provide you maybe information on, yes, they were a war veteran, what branch and unit they served with, maybe some of their work experience, places they lived, any information that's really going to help you get to your actual questions. So, doing this initial research can really be helpful. A good rule of thumb to remember is when we're doing this research is primary source materials are providing the first-hand evidence of an event, person, place, or object, and secondary sources are published materials that utilize primary source materials. So your primary source materials are those items that are found in the archives and include items like correspondence and newspapers and diaries and vital records and other documentation. Your secondary sources also could include newspapers, but are more like books and art and reference books and bibliographies and indexes. So just keep that in mind when you're doing these articles here. And you always want to remember that your family history doesn't exist in a vacuum. So, what we now see as history has marked your family in some way. And to understand why your family made the choices they made, you need to understand the historical context of the times they lived in. So, we want to make sure we're not adding too much presentism of what's going on in our lives now because we may look at it from a very different lens. Once you've done some research, now you want to start to craft your questions. So um, s- before you even do your interview, we want to make sure that we are thinking about the questions that you want to provide. Sometimes it's helpful to give these questions in advance to your narrator. This way, you can make sure that they have an idea of what the things you're going to ask and feel comfortable with that. So here are some sample questions that you might ask a relative, and all these are obviously dependent on who this relative is. So let's say your relative had witnessed the Challenger explosion, maybe on television when they were in their school classroom, for example. And you might do some research on it and find out, more about it. So let's say, they said that this Challenger explosion was the biggest one they witnessed. You might ask them, well, how did you know about it? Did you witness it on TV? Did your parents tell you? Did you know somebody that was actually on the Challenger at the time? Was there a distant relative, etc.? Other questions you may want to ask about are things about like their parents. So, who were your parents? What were they like? Um, why did they decide to go into a certain career for them? Was it something chosen for them, or did they decide to do something? Did you decide to enlist in the military? Did you decide to become a certain career? So those kind of questions that will give you that follow up. Here are some other examples of questions. So again, thinking about like, where you live when you were growing up? How did your family come to live there? That talks about migration and gets opening that question up. Were there other family members in the area? That can be really good with looking at that overall extended fan club. Family's religion, family stories that were heard. When you ask these questions, you want to make sure you're avoiding ones that are like yes no questions. So asking someone, did they like college, is not going to get you a very descriptive answer. We might want to say, well, what classes did you enjoy most in college? Okay, that's going to start to open up maybe some of the electives maybe they decided to take and tell you more about their major, etc. And ask them, well, why did you like this class? What classes didn't you like? Were there any professors that you got close to? So some generally good follow-up questions you want to use is things like, like when did that happen? Did this happen to you? What did you think about this? Can you give me an example? What happened after that? So really opening that person up to talk more. Some important etiquette to keep in mind is you want to keep your opinions to yourself. You're really using that interview to find out more about them instead of inserting your own biases and opinions into it. And it can be difficult because you may be thinking you want to add something about, like, oh, I have something I can relate to this, but that's not really your intent of your interview. So you want to think about, you have to remove yourself from that process. And knowing that the stories are going to be subjective, they're going to be based on that person's perception of how something happened. And they might have a whole nother opinion of it than if you asked siblings the same questions, for example. So you want to be really prepared to, hear what they're actually saying and documenting it. And sometimes people might get very animated and maybe talk with their hands more, and that might give you an idea of also reading body language and knowing if something is upsetting or if you need to switch to another topic, for example. So, or just giving you that extra context you might not be getting through words. So, here's some quick sheets of some do's and don'ts. Asking open ended questions, asking follow up questions. Try to avoid any jargon and acronyms that maybe they're talking about though, because that could be really hard to keep track of. For example, like if said something like the CIA, and if you didn't know that she meant the Central Intelligence Agency, you know, maybe she really meant the Culinary Institute of America. So that could be a confusing acronym to use. So you want to really spell out what something is. Um, Getting all the details. So if someone's mentioning a person, place, or event you don't know a lot about, ask for more information. Like who was cousin Sal? Why did you go to Pasadena? When did grandma and grandpa get married? So asking those follow-up questions to get that detail. Sometimes it even helps to even do a summary and just saying that, um, you're reviewing something you never said, but ask for more information. So, and trying to summarize like, okay, you've had this experience. What did you think about this? So, given that follow up, it's helpful to also ask one question at a time. You don't want to throw a lot of questions in at once because then they're not going to necessarily answer the questions, and you could confuse your person that you're interviewing as well. And share the outline, not necessarily adding the entire questions you want to give them. You want to have some room for flexibility on it, not make it feel like they're being interrogated. Don't ask leading questions, so make sure you're opening it up and you're not leading those biases in that you're adding in, and don't add things like you assume into that. Again, take yourself out of it. As I mentioned, you may also want to use props. So you may want to bring in some photographs or letters or other heirlooms because they might be able to actually look at something or touch something and be able to, have a connection to that moment when they're talking about it. Maybe you have a photo that is really mysterious and you want to know, well, who is that man in that photo? Can you tell me who that is? They might be able to tell you that because they physically have the photo in front of them. Or maybe there's something else on a document or a ticket stub that will draw another memory of that event. Step three, you want to think about deciding on how you're going to interview them. What is your platform? So there's a lot of options that are available today, and this actually has really opened up a lot more with online, especially since the pandemic, is that we have options like Zoom and Skype and Google Meet and other options that are available to actually conduct these all remotely and with having video options. And with a lot of these options here, you can do things like you can do recordings, which is a way to save a copy of those files and not having to scribble down notes the entire time. You also could do things like FaceTime through your phone or other phones as well. And you also could just do these in person. There could be an in-person audio or video one, or maybe you're thinking about a more informal one and just doing more of like an email correspondence, and maybe that could be potentially back and forth if they're more comfortable writing it out. Then you want to think about logistics as well, is making sure again you're picking a time when they're available and they're not being distracted, that they're comfortable, they're not getting too tired, especially when you're dealing with older relatives that may be dealing with things like dementia or other conditions. You don't want them to get into a sundown situation where they are not as sharp later in the day. So sometimes you might want to catch them earlier. You may need to schedule follow-up interviews. You want a place that's quiet, there's some privacy, there's not a lot of large sounds coming out, especially if you have like uh, cars driving by your house, sirens blasting, etc. And even just things like lighting, comfortable lighting, and being able to see your interviewee more easily, and also just be able that are helpful when you're doing video so that you can clearly see them and have that quality as well. When you begin to interview someone, you may want to start with some kind of opening statement that basically puts a timestamp and who is conducting it. So this interview is conducted by Susie Q on August 25th, 2025 at our respective homes. You can list the addresses. This interview is recorded on Zoom. Aunt Nancy will be helping to fill in some blanks on her family tree. So some kind of opening statement and what is the date, the location, the narrator's name, and a brief purpose statement is sufficient. And similarly, you want to have a closing statement then again. So you could say, this concludes Susie Q's interview with Nancy B on August 25th, 2025. Always make sure you thank your interviewee. So, Aunt Nancy, thank you so much for spending time with me this afternoon and help me with this project. You may want to consider taking a photograph or a screenshot of your interviewee so you have that information, and also have any kind of information that you need them to complete on an interview form, such as any consent forms or anything else you want to have them complete and fill out. So that interview information form could include things like the date of the interview, their name and address, who is doing the interview, which is likely you, your name and address, where is the interview conducted, how was it recorded, if it was recorded at all, what was the length of the interview and number of interviews, the subjects covered, and did you get some kind of consent or release form, so you have that comfortability knowing that you've done this. Step four, again, making your narrators comfortable is making sure that they felt that they may not be sure if their stories are very interesting or important to you. So, how do you make them comfortable with the process? Sometimes you might need to do what's called a pre meeting, where you're really going to meet with them, discuss what's going to happen with this interview, what we're going to cover, what their rights are during this interview. So, if they ever need to stop or have something redacted, if there's any forms you want them to fill out, and also just even just do some basic tech troubleshooting, especially if you're going to do this on something like Zoom or with video, making sure that all the technology is ready and working when you're ready to proceed. So, and then when you conduct the interview, you want to make sure you're following some of these steps, you're listening carefully, you're not interrupting your narrator, you're letting them letting them talk and let them keep going until they reach a pause. Try to minimize any verbal cues of, if you're, um, if you think feel like you're rushing them or something, or, you know, or if they think that, you're frozen on screen, maybe just give them a moment before you kind of ask them, just give them the time. Keep to what the narrator knows. So if there are certain things they don't know about, don't keep asking them about that particular event or people or places. Keep track of all the names and proper names for transcription that you might need to keep note of. That's really helpful when you're getting into more especially specific like townlands and other places that you want to note. And also just manage your time. Generally, you don't want to go longer than an hour. It could be a lot to do an interview and you could be very exhausted afterwards. So you want to make sure you're really just being sensitive to their time as well and knowing that you may just need to do a follow-up interview afterward if you have more questions. Some people are going to be very reluctant to be interviewed as well, so you need to keep track of the reluctant narrator. Again, they might not feel their story is unique enough, or they might say, "Oh, you should interview your uncle. He loves to talk." Or, "I'm not sure I'm really comfortable talking to a microphone," or "I have nothing important to say." You want to encourage them to share their stories and explain why their voice matters in your family history interviews. Because you know that they're going to be very unique to your project and they're going to have different reasons for why they're doing it. So you want to think about how you can make them most comfortable and think about, how you can do the interview with them. Maybe they need to think about something before they say it. Maybe there's just certain topics they're more eager to talk about than others. Other ways to engage. So, as I mentioned, you could do an interview via email. I've often done this where I've asked maybe some questions, just try to understand a couple of key facts, to kind of just, understand some things I want to know about. And sometimes maybe it could be a quick thing you just want to fill in something about the family tree. Maybe you even want to collaborate and work on this together. So I actually have a group of cousins that I get together with. A lot of us are like second, third cousins or so. Some of them are even closer, like first or and we even get on these Zoom calls every few months and we'll just one do some chit chat on how's everybody doing, what's going on right now. And we then get to a little bit of genealogy at times. So we might share like here's the latest thing that we're working on to try to figure out, how we're all related, and if there's any new developments in the DNA. And sometimes we'll get into that kind of collaboration. So you might think about doing like a Zoom session, maybe to do it more like, let's work on it together. Let's open up a Zoom and the internet and maybe plow into a particular line that you're interested in. And you could even make this into more of like a quote, an online family event, where you could invite other people to maybe even hear these stories. If they're comfortable, maybe you can make it where, grandpa's going to tell us some stories and, you can invite other members of the family if they're comfortable to hear it as well. And that can make it a lot more interactive, kind of like a family reunion. So again, nothing to repeat is that at this point, we want to remind people that it's not about you in this interview. It's really easy to get carried away and start talking about ourselves. And you want to relate something that you've done, but again, it's very simple just to pull back and just remember that you might think about things when you type it up later or transcribe it, but for now, don't interject your story into their interview. And with step 5, you want to think about interviewing your next steps. So what are you going to do with the information from the interview? In some cases, you may not ever show it to anybody else. It could simply be for your own personal family history research and that you're just using it just for your own purposes and no one else is going to hear it. They may be okay with maybe immediate family members hearing it. Perhaps they're even interested in it going to a archive that is doing an oral history project or used in a published book. But again, you want to make sure you're really being very clear on your intentions of what you're doing with that to make sure that they are okay with releasing that. When we have oral history projects through our organization, such as we have a Jewish Voices project with the Wider Family Jewish Heritage Center. We have release forms that are actually filled out by each person when they're releasing that information to us because it is going to be publicly available. So you want to be very cognizant of that. So with informed consent, you want to make sure you're telling them what is the purpose of your project, what are their narrator rights. So in some cases, if there is a oral history donated to an archive, they could actually say, oh, the only people that can hear it is, immediate family members, or they have to go through an approval process, or some other. There could be rules that could be put in place at an archive potentially, or they could decide, okay, yes, someone can hear it but they have to only hear it on site. They can't be publicly on the internet, etc. And sometimes there might even be just other confidentiality. Maybe they don't want their full name to be released out and they want to have a little more confidentiality with how they're being seen. Step 6 is then creating your digital stewardship plan of what are you actually doing with the interviews, if you decide to donate to an archive or not. So the first thing you want to do is think about creating your records. So either you're starting a Word document, you're taking a photograph of your document. You want to think about preserving that this interview did take place, coming up with some kind of file structure with a file name, a folder, if you're adding metadata, how you're going to back up the data, and how are you going to check in also with your narrator as well, knowing that, letting them know that it's available. With file management, you want to use something very similar to what we did before with documents. So in this case, here was a naming convention. So we might say that, so this was developed by one of our past archivists, Stephanie Call, and she said, she was the narrator. She used call, she used then the first initial, middle initial, then the date of the interview, and then the name of the narrator is then listed along with the date as well. And then your file names is really going to depend on really who the names of your interviewee is as well. So it's really more important that their name is very clearly in that file name. So when we talk about metadata, this is really just the internal data that you can put into different files, which could have more information just to describe an item. So there are ways of how you can add this metadata, and this is usually done through different editing software and electronic files, where if you really wanted to get fancy, you could add additional details on there. If you're not sure, this is something that, someone that is more tech savvy, like in an archive, would be able to add as well. You want to then think about then transferring that unedited audio or video recordings to a computer hard drive ASAP to make sure that it is preserved, making sure you have enough storage on there, and that you can handle it as well. And also then save the unedited files to no fewer than 2 additional locations, just to make sure that you have enough places so you don't lose it. Your storage options might be something in the cloud, for example, like Dropbox is a really great place to do. An external storage drive, optical media like a CD or DVD is another way to do well. So a little acronym we like to use is LOCKS, is lots of copies keep stuff safe. Because if you have it in multiple places, you have backup options if one copy gets corrupted. That does mean you need to sync and monitor multiple systems. So you need to, be familiar with those systems so you can keep track of when you make updates. And having a local copy with the security is helpful. However, sometimes, if you're trying to add this to places like the cloud or other places, you might need to incur an additional cost if you're trying to have multiple storage areas as well. So keep that in mind. And then there are different preservation file formats that you can use. So for audio files, very commonly, a lot of people will use it as an MP3 file, but you can do it in WAV and WMA and other formats listed here. It's generally recommended for a preservation format, you use the WAV file because that's a little bit more consistent, and access an MP3. And for video, usually you access it as an MP4, but there are different options available as well, noted here. And actively preserve. Make sure you're backing up your files, you're checking up on all the files, making sure there's not any corruption issues, making sure there's no sound quality issues with hearing different copies. Always making sure you're using your latest version and remembering the 222 rule. Keep two copies in two different formats, so like MP3, WAV, and two different locations so that you can make sure you have copies of that data. So, in review of this class, you want to make sure that you're first starting with yourself and surveying your collection and identifying the names and materials that you have at your fingertips, which could include what you already have in your collection as well as inherited research. You then want to classify and organize that collection to make these items easier to find in the future. You then want to review the genealogical research and evaluate the content against what you already know, especially create that running to-do list with questions that surface, and finally, conduct any interviews that you need with family members to fill in the gaps and keep a copy for your records. Thank you, and let's turn to our last Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Melanie, for that wonderful lecture this evening. Great start to this course. So we don't have any questions in at the moment. I'll give you all kind of a few seconds here in case anybody's frantically typing a question. We'll give you a moment to get that submitted. So let's see here. I know we are a little bit over time, so I'll just give you a moment here in case any come through. Okay, so we did just get one in, Melanie. So someone asks, if the member you interview passes away before the release is signed, who gives permission?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would generally look at who is their next of kin, especially who might have been named as the administrator of their estate, because at least for probate purposes, they might have had their person's best wishes at heart, especially if they had a will in place. You may want to see if that person had any kind of genealogical will, because they might have had a a note about preservation of their materials or items or things they participated in that might have accounted for that. So I would really say start with the administrator of their estate and check to see if they have the genealogical will in place and go from there on getting consent from next of kin.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Melanie. So it's looking like that will wrap up questions for this evening. So we'll leave it there. But if you do think of any questions later on, please do feel free to write to us at education@nehgs.org, or you can also write to Melanie directly. You'll find her email address on the course webpage and on the handout for this evening that she created as well. Also mention if you are interested in having us do research on your behalf, you can contact us at research@nehgs.org. And if you have more general reference questions about any area of your family history, you can chat with our genealogists for free Monday through Saturday from 9 to 5 Eastern Time. And you can access this free service at americanancestors.org/chat. Again, totally free and open to the public. I highly recommend checking that out. You can also book a one-on-one consultation with one of our experts at the link shown on the screen here, or through the QR code displayed there as well. I'll also mention that Melanie is one of our genealogists who gives a lot of these consultations, so you can also book one with her if you'd like. You will find a recording of this class as well as a handout and the slides at the course webpage shown on your screen. There were also a few resources that Melanie mentioned tonight that I'll include in my follow-up email, and I'll also add them to the resources section of this page as well. The URL for this page has been shared with you by email, and you can also find it under the My Account section of our website under digital content, and you will have access to all of these materials for the foreseeable future. So thank you again for joining us for this online course. We hope that you have learned more about how to kind of jumpstart your family history this January. Next week, David Lambert will be joining us to discuss deciding what you want to learn. To access that session, you can use the same link that you used this evening on the course page to join that Zoom session. So I look forward to seeing you all again next week, and goodbye for now.